Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast. I am absolutely delighted to have my personal hero and mentor on the show today, Frank Nero. Frank Nero is an alumnus of the Florida State University. He was an instructor turned director of FSU Florence from 2016 until December of 2022. And he not only helped the university earn a top-ranking position in study abroad programs, but he integrated his American students into the wider Florentine community through extensive collaborations with local charities. That includes, but is not limited to, the Cori la Vita Cancer Walks, the AWA, an organization for advancing women artists and restoring their works, the Florence city cleanups to help reduce the effects of mass tourism, which is a variable for educators in Florence. And most importantly, he's an award-winning instructor and art historian who has made an enormous impact teaching on-site in Florence and all around Italy to Florida State University students. Renaissance people, Frank Nero.
Thanks, Reed. When you started this podcast, I was so impressed by it that a former student and even colleague, I guess we could say, when you came to work at the study center for 3 semesters, was so inspired by what they experienced while living in Florence that, not only did you decide to pursue a graduate degree in all things Italian Renaissance, but that you began this podcast. And so happy that you invited me on, and it's a pleasure to be here.
I did a semester at FSU Florence when Frank was director, and went around the city with him and went on his city tours. And I was there as an Italian language student. I left as an art history student. So, and I think a lot of people have had similar experiences there. So tell us.
Feel free to call me Nero. I'm kind of proud of that imperial name. So if you slip up, don't worry about it.
Yeah, I call you Nero. I was trying to be official, and you even had a bust of Emperor Nero in your office.
Yeah, I did. Kind of ridiculous in that he was the worst emperor that Rome ever had, but
that's the irony of it all, right?
Yeah.
So what is it like teaching art and teaching art history in Florence? And what access does that give you as an educator?
Well, Reed, I became director in 2016, but I actually started teaching the history of art in 2003 as a graduate student in Tallahassee, Florida. And in 2005, I got the opportunity to go to Florence to teach at FSU's campus there in Italy. And I just stayed. I loved it so much. And like you, I am an alumnus of not only of Florida State University, but undergraduate. But I also did the FSU's Florence program as an undergraduate student all the way back in 1994. So the FSU Florence program has been, a part of my life for a majority of my adult years. So what it was like, it was the adventure of a lifetime. I mean, it was almost 20 years that I fulfilled different roles at the study center, from student to faculty member to an admin, the head admin guy, on the resident director on site in the city. So Florence and Italy have become, and still are in many ways, inseparably linked to my identity as a person. And that's just speaking about me. The thing that gave me the most joy, and I think what probably would reward aspiring Italian Renaissance people if they want to be teachers or art historians and go teach abroad, not just in Italy, but any country abroad, is the way sort of you and your students enter into the slipstream of history, just something new and for Americans and something so out of the ordinary. And I remember my first time as a student in 1994, I had no idea what art was. I didn't even know where Florence was on a map. Even if I was a history major, the art wasn't my thing. And in my senior year at FSU, undergraduate, I just did it with my roommate as a whim to do something crazy my senior year before graduating. And it actually turned into this unexpected path. Why I'm saying that is because I remember the first time seeing these works of art in these museums in Florence as an impressionable 20, 21-year-old, and my appreciation for something deeper and more meaningful to the college experience really took hold of me. In the intervening years between 1994 and 2005, when I was able to make my way back, I wanted to give the same experience to students that I received. And that was one of the underlying forces that made me do this for so long. And I think that's one of the most rewarding parts of this job, is that you get to be a Virgil, like Dante had going through the circles of hell, purgatory, and paradise. And sometimes teaching on site in Florence is, all three of those books.
In
Paradise,
July.
and it could be hell, and purgatory. So yeah, I mean, I'm not into myth busting and things like that, but it's like any other job. It's a grind. It's not like you see in movies or in novels, La Dolce Vita, living the Italian way. It's a job, and it could be a career, but it's also a struggle. In the old days, and basically in the old days, I mean the 1990s, it was very easy to get a visa to go work in Italy and work for the American Study Abroad programs. There was the lira still all the way up until 2001, which also made life in Italy very economic. And you could almost refer to those as the good old days. By the time I got there in 2005, with the European Union and the Schengen and the visa requirements for these European countries, especially Italy, being so difficult, it's hard to be an aspiring young art historian and say, I'm just going to pack up and go to Italy and teach Michelangelo's David in the museum. It's a lot longer journey than that. If you're a legal resident of these countries. Most of the Americans that I knew who would work at the study abroad programs either had married an Italian or other European Union member, or they had researched their heritage going back a couple of generations and were able to get their Italian citizenship, and therefore they were legal to work in Italy. That's what I did. So that's one thing. It's a journey. Now, one of the ways that aspiring art historians, and I highly recommend it to everyone, especially if you're under 35 and you're looking for an adventure, and maybe not so much looking to make it a career, you can get hooked up with your university if they have a study abroad program. And sometimes universities and colleges will send a graduate student, or even, of course, an associate professor or full professor for like a summer term. A term has to be under 3 months because that's the limit. And you would have to show proof that you're being compensated strictly by your home campus and not the study abroad program on site in the host country. In fact, how even these universities are able to function in Italy, beginning in the early 2000s, is that these universities have to construct a host country nonprofit entity. It's that entity not the university. It's that Italian entity, if we're talking about Italy, that will actually hire you. And you'll have a European contract or an Italian contract rather than sort of a contractual relationship with your home campus. If you're not going there for a short semester when your university can possibly send you. And of course, that's during the summer, which is the high tourist season. It's 100 degrees in Florence, not really a comfortable time. So those are some of the ways that you could actually, get your butt over there to do this great thing, which is to teach art history in situ before the monuments and the works of art.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show. Let's talk a little bit about students. When I remember when I came there as a student in 2016, I was I was in the Department of Modern Languages. I did French and I did Italian, language and culture, and I arrived there on Via Romana. That's where we had the one residence at the time. And I was actually really, really shocked that I was the only person there studying Italian and not yet art history, but I had signed up for coursework in art history while I was there. But then still, so
that actually leads me to some of the points that I had jotted down here as sort of prompts. Yeah, that's a real myth-busting point in that I think study abroad, and especially studying abroad in Italy, especially with the advent of social media and Airbnb and that great American myth of Italy providing, that bohemian escape for the American. I mean, you can go back in literature and art, maybe even 2 centuries, right? There's always been that myth about Italy. And I think what has happened is that study abroad in Italy, but not just Italy, and other European countries as well, has become sort of a rite of passage for university students, in that before you graduate, you have to do a semester abroad. A handful of students that we would actually get had background in art history or in Italian language. And it was more an opening of gates, use the cliche, a broadening of horizons for the student. I actually wasn't disappointed by that part once I started teaching there in 2005. I love that aspect of it, in that I would receive students who were blank slates, blank canvases when they got to me. And I got to mold them and shape them and form them. Most of the classes that are taught at these study abroad programs are just introductory classes to the Italian Renaissance. Very rare you get upper level classes if you're an undergraduate. They come to not knowing the basics, even like who the Pope is, why the papacy is in Rome, why is the Vatican the way it is. So I would start out with the basics. What's the meaning of the word Florence? What's the meaning of the Renaissance? Is that a myth? Is that real? What is Tuscany? And I would start out that way, sort of really trying to establish the foundations before we went on to like the good stuff. I like doing that. I think one of the traps that a lot of instructors and professors at study abroad institutions could fall into is that they expect students to know more than the basics and to be advanced. That's a struggle. When I became director in 2016 up till the end of 2022, when I would interview potential faculty members, that was one of the first things that I just said to you that I would say. Start with the basics and then move on to the deeper and greater meanings and things. And you'll see that the students will respond. So, art history is one of those disciplines that can go either way, man. You can lose them on the first day when you start dropping dates and lines and style and chiaroscuro modeling. On that first day, you gotta catch them with the juice, with the meat, and the excitement and enthusiasm. And you'll see that 99.9% of the students they'll reflect back to you the enthusiasm that you bring to the classroom and while teaching on site. So it could be a struggle at first, especially if your expectations are different. But if you go in with that mindset, you'll be okay, and it'll be rewarding.
Yeah, I remember we had a lot of times when I came back to work for you, students come in, they arrive when orientation is happening, like the hour of or the night before, and they're jet lagged and they didn't get out into the city, and then you run them through the whole day of this is the program you're in, and they're hungry and they're tired. But then the program assistants, you have us take them on a little city walk, and we would do it in a way that most of them hadn't seen the Duomo. They didn't get to that part yet. And we would do it in a way where we would pop in through one of these narrow side alleyways that came out of the orientation hall. And I always like to do this walking backwards so I can see their faces. When people who you realize a lot of them really don't know where they are in the stakes of the history that they are going to learn until they see that in their jaw hits the floor.
For me, that was always part of the magic and what ultimately made me stay there for such a long time. Just like anything else, there's pros and cons to it. And that's why I really recommend going to teach abroad to young people, 35 and under, if you had to be ideal, because, you have to expect to go over there. You're not going to make much money. Little known fact, Florence has the highest rents in all of Italy, projected for 2024. Second highest in all of Europe after Portugal, mainly because of Airbnb, which is transforming both the physical as well as the economic landscape of the city. So housing is extremely expensive. Rents could be very high, anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 a month, especially if you want to live in the historical center. But that's also happening outside of the historical center as well. And the reason for that is Airbnb.
And I want to touch on that because I want to link this to something else that I brought up in your introduction, is that there is a local, like, Florentine public opinion about both presence of American students and the weight of mass tourism are sort of put together to be this sort of like anti-Florentine concept publicly through their media. But you put a lot of work into integrating FSU students into the local Florentine communities. Do you think that your work in doing this helped buffer that sort of harsh outlook on the relationship between, like, Florentine society and Americans in Florentine society?
So you almost said reading my thoughts here. Such good points. Where to begin? Italians, and this goes back to what kind of access are maybe afforded to an art historian working at a study abroad program in Italy. Italians do not make a distinction between a professor lecturing to his class of eager undergraduates before the images and a tour guide with his day trippers following it around. So it can be quite the battle, especially in high season, which is 10 months of the year right now. Only January and February really will you get easy access to the museums and where they're comfortable to lecture in fact, why I said 35, I meant to be facetious a little bit. I'm an old man now, I'm 51. But when you go out to teach on site, especially in Italy, especially in Florence, you have to be sound physically and you have to be sound mentally. You have to research sort of every kind of tool that you have at your disposition to find that patience, to find your voice. You have to have your mask on, you have to have your suit of armor on to the outside world, but to your students, you have to be sort of the human, the enthusiastic prof who once was in the same boat as the students. And so it's a hard thing to manage. Of course, there's a lot of ways to combat that and to help you out with that sort of strategy. But when there's not that distinction made, and it's also kind of difficult too, in that the money is the same in the sense of what Italians charge to get into a museum. Mm-hmm. So for instance, one trip to the Uffizi right now is 30 euros. Mm-hmm. When I first started in 2016 as a director, we'd have a budget of 25 euro per student per class. So the budget in recent years has just been exploded. The rise of prices, the booking fees, because you can't just roll up to a museum and expect to get in. You have to have the staff usually on site will reserve for you months in advance on what day you want to go to the Uffizi or to the Accademia or to, the Pitti Gallery, so on, or the Bargello, so on and so forth. So good in one sense is that, gives you ample time to prepare. That adds up in terms of budgeting for the study abroad programs. Not only that, now it's mandatory that everybody get set up with headsets. They're called whispers over there.
Yeah.
So mandatory in every site now where you speak into the little mic and the students have the awful earphones in their ear and they have to listen to the lecture that way.
I remember when
go ahead.
We would go to Rome, and I'm going to go to this next one just so that we can look at some other images here of the different sites where you've taught. But we would go to Rome. We're in St. Peter's Square, and there's 5 of us assistants, and we each have a backpack full of these auricolari, the whispers.
Yes.
I remember I would somehow, they're heavy. When you have got 150 students, they all need to have one. I'd end up with 3 of these backpacks, and the other assistants are nowhere to be found. And now I'm carrying around Rome 100 pounds of these.
Oh, that's why I said you have to be physically and mentally fit if you want to take this on as a as a job. Not that I'm the fittest dude in the world, God knows, that's for sure. But you have to really mentally prepare. And the lessons are another thing that surprises a lot of people when they first go in Florence, is that the lessons have to be 3 hours long. And that's a long haul for both you and the students. The reason for that is, of course, you go to the Uffizi, you have to, find the reservation line. You get in the reservation line. You should do that by yourself without your students, by the way, so make them wait somewhere totally away from where you're going to be. Give the reservation number with the school credit card, or if perhaps they already paid for it online nowadays. They give you the tickets. Then you have to bring out the tickets to your students and distribute them. Then the guy with the headphones comes, the whispers, and you have to set up all the students with their headphones and their gears and do a test and make sure each one works. Then you have to finally get in line for groups with the reservations. So even if you have a reservation for, let's say, 9 o'clock in the morning, you ain't getting in at 9. You're most likely getting in at 9:45, 9:30 maybe. Then once you get to the front of the line, you have to go to security with 25 students, however number of students you have. That takes quite a bit of time. It's chaos there. Then inevitably a student will have their backpack. No backpacks are allowed in the museum. So you have to wait for 5 or 6 of them to go check their backpacks. And by the time you're ready to start, you're exhausted and you're an hour and 15 minutes into your lecture time.
Yeah.
And that will happen at a lot of places. So you have to be, 3-hour classes. You got to be ready to go. And pensaci un pochino. I didn't just teach for Florida State. I taught for a whole variety of programs there to make ends meet. Sometimes I would have 2 or 3 of those 3-hour on-site lectures a day. So it was a hard slog, and you get mentally and physically drained if you want to be able to pay your rent and pay your heating bill. And
when I was your student, so you were director, you were teaching an art history class, but you were also, just for listeners to understand the difference, with a semester long, let's forget the summer for a second, a semester long study abroad program, you also have the multiple trips and the day trips.
Right.
So you work 5 days a week as director and as teacher, but then you've got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you've got to get 100 kids to Rome, but then you're also lecturing in Rome. So students who aren't even yours, just anyone who wants to come along, now you have 25 people to cart around through Piazza Navona or whatever you're doing, which is...
Once we began to expand, though, maybe around 2008, 19 or so, right before COVID, it broke my heart, but I just couldn't manage all of that anymore. So we were able to have, add other art history classes with other art historians art history lecturers who were able to take over a lot of those duties for me. But yeah, in the beginning, man, I was a jack of all trades, plus the soccer coach.
Plus the soccer coach.
Yeah, there on the field.
For people watching.
It was good to show the students that you're a human too, not just the guy lecturing to them all the time. And that helped a lot. The more the students saw you out from behind that damn computer, whether it be in the classroom or on the weekend trips or on the soccer field or other extracurriculars, karaoke night.
You put together a resident. By the time we had 5, I think we had 5 residences going. You put together this resident tournament, and you had us coach our residents. Now, mind you, listeners,
yes, I did.
I don't play.
You weren't expecting that, huh, Reed? As part of the job description.
But I was determined we were going to win. Okay.
But admit it, you had fun.
I had a blast. Yeah. But it was a lot of fun. But you guys, beyond the residence ones, you guys actually won a championship in Florence, didn't you?
Well, during my tenure as coach, we won 2 championships.
2.
And they won a 3rd last semester. So I'm very proud of that.
That's awesome.
We used to be 0-10 every semester, and we finally made that turnaround once we were able to expand a little bit, get some more student athletes and get kids enthusiastic about, running around, competing. So, not just sports. I thought that other activities, such as volunteering, which was the main question that you asked me.
And I wanted to ask about some memorable moments. Anything can happen when you're in the city, exposed to the people, the elements, exposed to the students' previous night of binge drinking, exposed to any of these things. Are there any stories you have off the top of your head of just some of these sort of excursions that had a bit of a twist to them?
Well, I mean, I could fill a volume as big as War and Peace with that. Well, one goes back to being mentally and physically sound, because some memorable moments that stick out to me, it is inclement weather. And it's very difficult to repeat your lecture, whether you're on a weekend trip and in Rome for just a little glimpse at the Forum, or it's your day to teach the Piazza della Signoria in Florence, and you're out in front of Cellini's Perseus and Medusa. Freezing cold temperatures, whipping winds, sandstorms in the Roman Forum, heat which could reach 100, 110 degrees in the summer when you're in the outside spaces. I do remember that sandstorm in the Roman Forum, just blinding everybody, whipping pebbles against their skin, and I just kept on going. And whoever wanted to come along, the thought in the back of my head was, this is the first time that these students, and most likely the last time that these students are going to see the Pantheon. So I'm not just going to say wing it or run away because it's hailing or raining or whatever. You gotta power through it. You lose some along the way, obviously, but they want to see this stuff too and learn about it. So weather is always a memorable moment. Fights with with tour guides. You always have to jostle for positions in front of works of art. I remember one time a tour guide called me a crazed dog in front of it was actually a Botticelli's Primavera. One time a security guard in the museum came up to me and said that university lectures aren't allowed in the academia, and I knew that wasn't true, just because he was probably lying to me and thought I was an amateur or a novice, didn't know Italian or whatever. So tried to make us move along, and I couldn't finish my lecture in front of the David, so I had to end up calling out the director of the museum and making a scene. And
Yeah, I appreciate.
And then imagine having to go back to your lecture on like Michelangelo's David after all that, and wrap it up. So those are some memorable some students, of course, are feeling a little green from the night before. One student I always used to tell this story. One student, not a Florida State student, let's preface that, but one time we're in the Uffizi and we're standing in front of, I'll never forget it. We're standing in front of Gentile da Fabriano's Adoration of the Magi.
Love that.
Gather my group around me in a little semicircle, and I'm going at it with all the details, saying this is one of my most beloved paintings, and getting into international Gothic and what the dress means and all this, so on and so forth. And I just happened to look up away from the painting, and I just see this student turn green and projectile vomit all over my, sweet white Brooks Brothers button-down shirt, splashing on the floor. And I'm like, oh, geez, what am I going to do? Turn to the side of my head and just see that the security guard had turned around and went into another room. And I'm like, guys, let's get the hell out of here ASAP. It wasn't us. And we just, the ugly Americans, right? And just went into I had to keep on going, man. We only had a certain amount of time in the Uffizi. And of course, one of the student's friends took care of that student. Another time in Santa Maria Novella, one of those hot July days in Florence, that church would get steamy in the summer, and it was like the Arctic in the winter. Anyway, we're standing there in the nave, looking up at Giotto's crucifix, and all of a sudden, this poor female student just fainted straight away. Boom. Hit that hard stone ground. I can't remember now what was wrong with her, but I just remember like they materialized from the cracks in the pavers in the church. Nuns. They were even Dominican nuns, which are appropriate for that church. They were wearing the black and white habits. And they came out and they were giving Gatorade to this poor student and nursing her back to health. Stuff like that. On the other hand, I don't want to, discourage people who may not want to deal with that. Does build character, that's for sure. Not afraid of anything now with everything that went through both as a director during COVID, especially, and being constantly on site for several different universities. I've seen it all. Of course, the great joys, Reed, were like you pull off the lecture of your life in front of Michelangelo's David, right? You pull off the lecture of your life and you leave the kids just standing there, awe-inspired. You hit every point and the blocking that you wanted to do. And even though you're exhausted, there's no better feeling than being able to pull that off. I haven't found a better feeling. And this is very important, Reed. Sorry to keep going on. You need to approach every on-site lecture almost as an actor. And what I mean by an actor, not just putting on a performance, but you need to go to the museums before your lectures and see how everything works, understand the rhythms of the crowds. You need to pick out the works of art in all the different rooms before you give that lecture. And those museums are constantly changing things around too. Things are constantly dynamic. So you have to keep up with where the paintings that you want to teach are located. How best can I access them? Know your blocking too. So you're just by observing the crowds and other groups that may go through, you want to see, okay, where can I gather up my kids to talk about this aspect of this certain work of art? Where can I give them a little break? Where will they allow me to sit them down and give them sort of like the historical context before we actually tackle the work of art? And another mistake that a faculty member teaching in situ might make is that you got to get away from like style and line and color and the artist's biography. What the kids, especially the beginning students, almost all of them will never take another art history class again. You're the exception. But there are a lot of good exceptions, that's for sure. And I don't mean to blow that off. I think that even students that are getting their business degree or marketing degree, they become a much more well-rounded individual and do bring the things that they process while studying abroad, including going to see works of art in the museum, to their daily lives and to their job places. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But you have to tell what the students want to know, that are especially of that makeup, is what does the work of art mean? Why is it important to me? What are the figures in this work of art trying to convey? What is the story? I almost view teaching on site as an art form, almost like writing a short story, in that the short story is the lecture and it should have a powerful opening that grabs the students' attention, makes them want to be there. You set them up with a little suspense, and then the works of art themselves should become the characters in this short story, the protagonists and the antagonists. And then at the end of that 3-hour lecture, however long it is, sort of all the different lines of thread you presented these, I guess the works of art would be the lines of thread that you presented to these students. You weave into this greater tapestry, I guess, or mosaic. And that I saw takes, quite a bit of time to learn. But that I saw really worked with the students. When I would do Michelangelo's David, we would start behind the Duomo and look at where it was originally sculpted at the Wool Guild's offices there, and where it was originally supposed to go, high up on one of the piers on Florence's cathedral. And it like worked them through the drama so that they're ready when we approach the work of art in the museum. to get wowed, and then you wrap it up at the end.
I just want to transition us, but before I do that, I want to ask you, for those of you who are not watching, I'm looking at this background of books that you have, and I'm really curious about what's going on back there.
These are all art history books, Reed. I must have, and these aren't all of them. I still have maybe 150 or 200 or so in Florence that I've been meaning to ship back. Eventually, I'll get around to doing that. But these are, I don't know, probably around 800 art history books. And then you can't see it, but in other areas in this room, there's bookshelves filled with, novels and nonfiction, stuff like that.
It's funny because I remember in Florence, you would often talk about and lament and miss your books that were back in the United States. And now that you're in the United States, you're like, oh, I have all these books in Florence I need to get back.
Yeah, now it's the opposite. It's funny. I remember reading a passage from Cicero that said, all a person needs to be happy in life is a library in their home and a garden. And it's funny that you said that. Now, I always lament that most of my books were either in the States when I was in Italy, and now it's vice versa. The sickness was, after reading that passage, is that if I read a book, somehow for me to process it, I have to keep it. I have to own it. I have to possess it. I don't know why. It's weird. If I ever want to go back to, I almost never do, but sometimes I do. You want to go back to it, especially helpful when you're preparing your lectures, obviously, like that. So nice to have these books in your own environment where late at night you're preparing your lectures and things like that. But whether it be from 2005 to 2014 when I was an instructor, or even when I became a director, it just, the timing, wasn't always right. And I always say this, in my 30s, it was like cool to be poor and studying art history in Italy. You get tired of living in that one room, one window, you know what I mean? Yeah. Hearing all your neighbors' business and flushing the toilets, you want. And the economy of Florence and the things that I explained before, the salaries and the taxes and the contributions, visa issues that your home campus really can't send you and pay you what you would make in New York City or Tallahassee or Athens, Georgia, going to Italy. You're basically an adjunct. You could have your PhD in all kinds of publications, but you're basically an adjunct of that institution's campus there. So this is maybe a word of advice if there are any wealthy people out there, or donors, or even university administrators, is that, conventional wisdom is that the staff, faculty, even the resident director are like living la dolce far niente, la dolce vita. And it's not, couldn't be further from the case, especially right now. I think that a lot of problems and issues and chaos could be remedied and avoided. I think what a lot of these people working permanently at study abroad centers need is sort of a peace of mind that they'll be able to afford rent for themselves and their family and their bills. And I think it's about time that an investment should be made, especially by donors, if you're interested in international education, to maybe get some of these resident directors vested positions, or, for instance, they have nothing to do with the home campus, so they don't get benefits of any kind, retirement, that sort of thing. Or even getting a donor sort of investing in an apartment or a residence. And there are tax-free fringe benefits that Italy has for that to happen. So there are creative ways. And it would be really nice if home campus admins and donors, it's a struggle right now, and I understand, but I think that should be the next evolution of study abroad.
So for the admins, the donors, anyone who's listening, this is your call to action. Don't
That's
sleep
right.
on it, right? So I think this is a good spot to sort of cinch part one of our interview. We're talking about really the nuts and bolts of living and teaching in Florence, the interaction with students, the interaction with community, and that gray in between area that educators are sort of navigating in terms of like labor rights and this sort of.
That's a great way to put it. It's an in-between area.
Thank you all for tuning in to the first part of my interview with Frank Nero, who just took us through the nuts and bolts of teaching art history in the Renaissance city itself, Florence, Italy. We're going to put his skills to the test in part 2, and he is going to give an example of his on-site lecture of San Martino del Vescovo, a little-known site in Florence where he would take students to study the frescoes of Ghirlandaio and his workshop. Tune in next time, and arrivederci.